And yeah. Okay, so the title of my talk is Hope in the Time of Settler Colonialism. The reason for this topic, for this title, is well, it's quite simple. And mainly, it's just about um, so the reason for the title is that one wouldn't often think of hope as a concept that can be associated with contexts where there's a legacy of oppression and where ongoing injustices are actually a continuation of historical injustices. So the difficulty that I was having when I was invited to present was on how to connect this idea of which is this concept, which is a very complicated concept and that has been explored throughout the centuries, at least in Western philosophy. And that mainly is about having something that people can rely to continue moving, to continue trying to change things. So based on that idea, I started to think, well, how can I apply this concept to the idea of dispossession and the elimination of the native? Again, very sensitive topics. And then in the documentary of Lupita, um, um, there is a scene where Lupita is asked, what does she expect for the future? And what are her hopes for the future? And she says, and I will explore that further on, that is about a future where things are different, where her children can not be subject to the same kind of injustices that she is a victim of. And to me, that was essentially the the idea that I wanted to explore in this talk, and that's the reason for the title. The subtitle of my talk, as you may see, is Indigenous Demands of Justice and Multicultural Political Theory. Um, and there's a reason for that as well. Also, I need to mention that all the pictures that I will be using, they have a credit on the part next to it, and that's because these pictures were given to me, were given by the director of the film Lupita, the documentary Lupita, but these pictures were taken by different persons. So that's the reason that the credits may vary from picture to picture. Okay, so this is the documentary is the Indigenous activist leading a new generation of Mexican women, and as you may have seen in the trailer, basically what happened in what is known as the Acteal Massacre is that in 1997, the army arrived to an indigenous communities in the south of Mexico and killed over 40 people who were just praying at the time. And it has been 3 decades basically since indigenous people have tried, since the survivors of the massacre have tried to hold the settler state accountable. I just introduced a very interesting term, which may not be very familiar to some of you, which is settler, the settler state. We often think of the state as something that is just state, but using the term settler state allows us to understand that there's a specific kind of relationship between the state of the society that emerges after a certain point in history and the communities or people living in the same territory before the emergence of that political entity. So the way I approach hope in this talk is as a binding element. And what I mean by that is something that connects three things. And I'm using this is a title actually from a book that is very interesting and that I recommend for everyone interested in the historical exclusion of marginalized groups to read. And the title is Voice, Trust, and Memory. So the idea here is that when an injustice happens, well, essentially groups and individuals are being deprived of a voice. But this voice at the same time play a role in how people share a destiny or share an experience, in this case, an injustice. And memory, in this case, also plays a key element in how people mobilize their demands for justice. So, as you may have already seen, I'm using this small phrase that Lupita mentions in the documentary, which is about keeping the memory alive of those who died in the massacre and to show resistance of the indigenous people. And what that means, and what I find interesting about this, actually, is that memory in this sense is a key element in how indigenous people continue their search for justice, continue the search for holding those accountable. So as you may have seen in the trailer, Lupita is actually mentioning the names of those who were in the government at the time of the massacre. So she mentions the name of the president back then, but also of the main politicians that were responsible for the massacre. So memory here and this injustice that takes place, the actual massacre, actually is something that provides indigenous peoples with a voice. And I will explain what I mean by voice in a minute. In the context of in a settler colonial context, voice means the way on how people frame under a certain identity and that suffer a certain kind of injustices because of how they've been framed by an external entity, in this case, the settler state, and thus the indigenous identity, they experience certain kind of injustices. But these injustices that take place because of their identity and identity imposed upon them, at the same time, and eventually over time, provides those framed under a certain identity with a platform that they mobilize to hold the settler state accountable. So in this case, the indigenous identity actually provides the victims of certain injustices with a voice, with a platform. And I'm using, as you may see, this small fragment of a speech by Marie Choi, who is the first indigenous woman candidate who in 2018 sought to become the president of Mexico, in which she denounces and she relies on the shared experience and the shared injustices to basically advance the point of trying to change that and trying to access justice. And again, memory here plays a key role in how indigenous people mobilize their identity. Now, the other part I'm interested in discussing is what I call the language of rights. So in a settler colonial context, and especially in multicultural political theory, often the claims raised by indigenous peoples are considered along the language of rights. And what I mean by that is that if they claim access to territories, if they claim the protection of certain customs, everything is associated with the right to culture, the right to territory or territorial rights, and so on. But I argue that this is not necessarily the only case, that it's actually a bit more complex. When we take into consideration how indigenous people mobilize their identity, the fact that it actually constitutes a voice that allows them to participate in spaces that of, of which they have been excluded from, then the demands raised by indigenous peoples, the claims raised by indigenous peoples are framed in a certain way because this is a language in which their exclusion has been made official. So when they talk about having control over a territory, sure, it means that, and in most cases, but essentially, if one follows this argument, if one follows this claim, it actually becomes claims about something else, something that is bigger. In this case, it's always about justice. It's always having, holding the settler state accountable on changing their relationship of domination with the state. So it's not only the right to having their culture protected, it's actually the way in which they participate, in which they resist the domination, the fact that they are subject to domination. So for me, that's the importance of the language, the language that indigenous people use, how they deploy this, because it shows a dimension, a political dimension that is often overlooked. And that's the reason that I put in the presentation, in the slides, that these cases show a hope to be heard. So using these terms, using the words of rights, it actually is the way in which indigenous people fight back against the terms of their exclusion. So the important part here is just the political grammar of the settler society, the language of rights. And I'm interested in, or the reason that I'm mentioning this is because it shows this dimension, which is often overlooked, which is often downsized to something cultural. And for me, it's a political dimension that shows that the claims are always political, that are always about justice. And this cannot be reduced to just cultural terms because in a settler colonial state context, where the dispossession of land is how the elimination of the native takes place, actually the claims are always about justice. It's always about resisting the settler state, fighting against dispossession. So in this picture, we can see Lupita, and we can see many of the demonstrations in which she participates, because she's a representative of her community, and she's also a member of an organization that whose only objective is to secure peace in the region. And the important part of this point is that Lupita is a representative, but this is an exception, and this is something that she mentions in the documentary. And so those are the reasons that I invite you to actually watch it, because in indigenous communities, at least in Mexico, women are excluded from being representatives or holding positions of power. So the fact that Lupita is a representative, or that someone like Marichu was able to run for president, it shows more of what it may seem. In the case of Lupita, she mentions in the documentary that she's a representative because that's the way in which the community sees a connection between her past and the future of the community. And with this I mean that she has been given the role of representative because she's a survivor of the massacre. So now let me talk very briefly about settler colonialism, which is a very specific form of colonialism. So it's a form of colonialism directed at native populations. It produces a number of injustices, but these injustices are only driven by the goal of attempting the assimilation of the indigenous people into the settler society. So this form of assimilation, this goal of assimilation takes several forms. In most cases, it's about forcing indigenous people to give up their land and to become part of the settler society. So or the settler state can deploy other technologies, such as all of a sudden saying that the indigenous elements belong to the dominant society, the settler society, and thus the indigenous people can no longer claim access to those resources, cultural resources. So it's all it's a number of technologies available to the settler state, which deploys to achieve one goal. In this case, the elimination of the native through the dispossession of land. And that's the reason that indigenous people frame justice as responsiveness to the historical and ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. And that's the reason that I argue that the claims raised by indigenous peoples are always demands for justice. These are always efforts to challenge the settler colonial state and holding it accountable. So again, indigenous people, and especially they mobilize their identity because this allows them to challenge that effectively. So this picture only shows one fraction of what their lives is about. It's about always fighting against the settler state and trying to, and its attempts to achieve their assimilation. Now, the part about demands of justice and multicultural political theory, which is in the subtitle of the talk. The reason that I'm interested in this part is because often when people theorize about what does it mean for indigenous people to have access to justice in a settler colonial context, political theorists tend to argue about cultural equality, or what it means to, they focus on the part of culture. So for them, it's always about cultural elements that need protection, cultural elements that need to be respected from non-interference, and so on. For them, indigenous people are these communities which have different or distinct cultural elements which need to be protected or respected. And it's not necessarily only that. The political dimension, that is how the indigenous identity has been imposed, and how it becomes a platform, and how understanding this part allows us to see their claims as something else, or something more than just claims for cultural accommodation, is something that is always overlooked if one only is interested in seeing these claims as claims for cultural accommodation. So that's my critique to multiculturalism, and, or as I put it, multicultural political theory. And I'm phrasing it as multicultural political theory instead of multiculturalism because I want to be clear that the problem is not necessarily the idea of multiculturalism, but how the claims are being processed or are being theorized by people interested in these arguments. So yes, so as the text says, it's always about cultural accommodation, It's never about cultural accommodation. It's always demands of justice for justice. And here we can see a picture of Lupita in a mobilization, in a demonstration, claiming justice for those that cannot do it nowadays. Now, as final comments, in this picture, we can see also something that can be considered a recurring picture in the indigenous communities in the south of Mexico. And that is these gatherings where indigenous people share their claims and continue their resistance towards the settler state. So for instance, if you look at the picture closely, you will see a close resemblance, of course, to the Zapatistas. And the reason for that is because even though Lupita does not belong to the Zapatistas, her organization and her community has a close link to the Zapatistas. And the reason for that is because they share the idea of the injustices suffered at the hands of the state, and thus the deployment of the identity of the indigenous identity as a platform takes the same form. So it's not so this, but an important aspect needs to be mentioned, and that is that by no means this implies that this means that indigenous, that there's no dissent within indigenous communities. There is. What I'm trying to say is that even though there's diversity in voices and interests and so on, but the way that identity is used as a platform to access justice is a recurrent is how things happen, and the thing that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's basically the main argument of my talk, that the indigenous identity in this case is a platform that indigenous people use to access justice, and memory and the very formation of the indigenous identity actually provides for indigenous people this platform, a platform which is informed by injustices and which allows them to see hope as something in which they can aspire for a different future, for a future in which they are no longer subjects of domination, in where ongoing injustices are not a continuation of a legacy of oppression. In other words, ongoing injustices are not an expression, a modern expression of historical injustices. That's the future that they see for themselves. That's the role that memory and their place in how they see a different future, a future in which, again, they don't suffer this kind of injustices, a future in which they can have a more symmetrical relationship with the state. Because if you see the documentary, if you watch the documentary, one thing that you will notice is that indigenous communities in Mexico, at least the majority of them, not even the Zapatistas, they don't seek separation from the state. What they seek is a less asymmetrical relationship, a more fair relationship with the settler state. They don't want to become a different nation. They just want to have access to justice and to stop being victims of such violent forms of injustices. And I think that's the aspect that always needs to be taken into consideration, because the problem with not doing so is that the political dimension, the role that memory plays in the aspirations of indigenous peoples for a different future, all that tends to be reduced into simple claims for cultural accommodation rather than for what I think they are, in this case, demands of justice. that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erik. You have a silent round of applause happening, I think, from the looks of the screen here. So thank you so much for that excellent talk following the trailer for the Peter documentary. And I think that was an excellent example of which to contextualize the arguments that you were making. Yeah, so thank you very much. Just a couple of comments before we take questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will put them to Erik when he's had a bit of a breather. But in the meantime, just a couple of things that I thought were really interesting about what you said, because you actually started out by saying that hope is not usually seen in a space where huge oppression is going on and where there have been historical injustices like the Acteal massacre. And then you kind of ended up by saying that hope is actually very present in the activities of Indigenous civil society. And that's something that I very much recognise as well and agree with. And I think not only Indigenous civil society, but civil society in general, right, is that actually we don't talk about hope, and it's not really kind of used as an idea of a way to conceptualize activities or ideologies or strategies, but I think actually it's very present, and that's I think what you ended up saying, right, is that it's very much used as a tool for motivation, as a tool for kind of keeping memory alive, which is really important in the work that they're doing, and in getting acknowledgement, I think, is the key thing, right, is acknowledgement of the injustices that have happened. Another thing as well, because you mentioned settler, the term settler state, which is that a term that comes from multicultural political theory? Sorry, because I don't study it, but
no, not necessarily. It's more like it's kind of is in a way implicit in the arguments of all these political theories, but it's not necessarily used as such. However, those are critics of multicultural political theory, and especially someone like Glenn Coulthard, who is an Indigenous scholar who brought a brilliant book on the critique of multicultural political theory, or the politics of recognition. The settler state is a concept that is used to try to show that there's a very specific kind of relationship between Indigenous people and the state. But yeah, it's a term that is, or a concept that is often not used in multicultural political theory, and I think that's part of the problem, that it's just assumed that for some reason these communities exist, at the same time we have this other entity which also exists, but they don't ask where the origins of any of those. They just assume that these are different, that this one integrated the other, and annexed this one, and that's it. But it's like, no, there's more to that. There's a history behind that, history of injustices that tends to be overlooked, especially if one don't use the terms that are for that, such as recognizing that these are very specific forms of political entities, such as the settler state. Is a kind of political entity that emerges at a certain point and all of a sudden defines the position of everyone, or every group. And if one doesn't use the term settler, well, this is not quite evident, and everything just becomes like so attractive because groups are exotic, and it's more than that.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite interesting, isn't it? How language, as we know, shapes the way we think about things and think about or erases history. And so, yeah, it got me thinking about how you mentioned the language of rights and how Indigenous communities are using the language of rights as a mechanism, I guess, as a tool to navigating and I suppose legitimizing their claims for justice in the settler in the settler state and within that context. And it's interesting actually because the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples doesn't use the term settler state, it just uses the term state because of course it's a UN mechanism and that's the terminology that is used. So yeah, I just thought it was quite interesting the way that I suppose that in itself is a form of assimilation, and that, you know, even though that was a mechanism that was developed by Indigenous peoples, it still doesn't use language which perhaps reflects accurately the history that has been experienced. So yeah, really, really interesting. So yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to say any more about that, about the language of rights before we take any questions, Erik? Or?
No, just very briefly that that especially if one is interested in the claims for natural resources about land, if one look at the history in countries such as Canada or even in other Latin American countries such as Mexico or Bolivia, these all claims for resources, they always tend to escalate. So they start by claims about having access to water or against privatization or against pipelines. But all these claims often escalate into demands of justice, into the imposition of private interests or the imposition of pipelines in a certain territory. For Indigenous people, it's not just that, it's about an ongoing injustice. So that's the reason that I think that when they claim against resource or against dispossession, it often one can see an escalation into bigger demands of justice. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that, again, often gets overlooked, especially by multicultural political theorists. And that's the reason that the interest is culture. And for me, it's problematic because it's more than that. It's more than the protection of some elements that people find exotic.
Exactly, and I suppose that's what I was thinking when you were explaining about this and the framing of Indigenous people's claims as you know, in the guise of protection of culture. It just made me think of how it's a very paternalistic approach to, you know, and it really yeah, it really kind of highlights that, doesn't it? Exactly. It's a lot easier to talk about protection than it is to talk about actual, you know, claims to resources, which, you know, many states, settler states would rather avoid. So we have some questions coming in. Yale says, really interesting talk, thank you. I was particularly interested in how do they actually create a genuine indigeneity? Is there still such a thing, or are these origins completely lost because of the long-term living with assimilation of settler colonialism? So that's a really interesting question.
It's a really interesting question, and it's a tough question. Well, the problem when I mean, I will start by saying that in multicultural political theory, basically the key idea behind most of the arguments is that cultures are unique, and that's the reason that they need to be protected because they are genuine. But there's a problem with that, and I think that, and it's not necessarily about the question, it's how it's often framed. That in a way, I think to answer the question is that I don't think it's possible, in the sense that indigenous people and indigenous identity is often, it often finds itself in a cycle of constant construction. So it doesn't remain frozen in a period of time. It continues to evolve as a result of the relationship of these with the settler state, with the identity of the settler state. So it's always in this process of constant construction. So we can think of this as a dialectical relationship between the identity of the settler state and the indigenous identity. So in none of the two remains frozen in time. And I think that that's the interesting part, that the process of that construction of being a response to something else. So in that sense, I don't think it would be necessarily genuine, but rather that it gets constructed over time. So it will be very difficult to locate it into a certain point of history and something that hasn't changed. So yeah, I think that it's not necessarily completely lost, but rather it actually reflects the resistance against the assimilation of the settler state. It shows that. So if one looks at the history of the indigenous identity in countries like Mexico, it shows this resistance, and that's the reason that I think that these are platforms for justice. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think as well that's why the aspect of memory is so important, because when you do have memory, even when there has been forced assimilation, then you have this memory that kind of reiterates that actually this, you know, this was or is the culture at this time. And of course, as you said, which is very important, is that culture and cultural identity is never static and it's constantly changing. And I think what's important as well when we're thinking about Indigenous rights is that there is a right of Indigenous people to have the option, right, to form their own identity and decide, you know, whether they would like to you know, use the cultural media of the settler state or their own you know, their own Indigenous cultural mediums as well. And that is an actual right that is enshrined in international law. So I think that's very important what you said about this duality of the kind of assimilation versus indigeneity, and that essentially it's kind of choice as well.
Yeah, I think I completely agree, because what I find interesting if one study the formation of the indigenous identity is that it often involves not it's not it is it it integrates many of the individuals that are part of the indigenous communities. So it's not just one group deciding the terms of the indigenous identity. It's a multitude of voices. Is a lot of dissent within groups that shape this identity. So, for instance, in some communities, or even Lupita herself, the way in which she participates is a way in which she rejects certain elements that are associated with the indigenous identity. And if one watches the documentary, she's very explicit about it, about fighting the very terms of the indigenous identity that have been constructed by her community, by her people. So it's very interesting on how there is a lot of voices that come together to define the terms of the indigenous identity as a fight, also not only within their norms and their beliefs, but also against the settler state. So it's a very interesting and dynamic um, form in which indigenous identity actually takes shape.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. So if anyone else has any other questions or comments, you can also feel free to turn on your video. You don't have to write in the chat if you want to say. There's not very many of us here, so that's also fine. Charles, please.
Hi. Hi, sorry, I'm a bit of an interloper, so I'm not. This isn't my background, but I look after archives and records, and we've got a lot of sort of post-colonial records here at York, mainly from Africa. But it struck me what you're saying on, the impact and importance of voice, memory, and trust. And obviously, I was wondering really whether that assimilation of memory, identity, and culture, whether that also extends to or is echoed in colonial records, and that, because obviously they can play a big part in shaping memory and the expression of identity and giving voice to rights and injustices. We've got some records that were collected at the time about a massacre in southern Africa, and I wondered, sort of, are there power imbalances in who has those records, controls them? Is the narrative ultimately controlled by the government, or those communities that you're working with? Not say it's a battleground, but where if they're trying to raise that voice, creating records like your documentary, and that, does that play a big part in giving that voice and counterbalancing a narrative? Or is it sort of struggling against a larger sort of recorded narrative that will shape the identity of the massacre and its impact?
Oh, thank you so much, Charles. It's a very, very, very good question. So I will try to answer it, but please jump in if I fail to do so.
No worries.
So yeah, records played a big part in how the narrative is being told. So for instance, for critics of the politics of recognition, there's no point in seeking the recognition of the settler state, because there's a certain narrative and everything has to fall within that narrative. And that's the reason that they don't see any reason in participating in dialogues. And they argue against participating in dialogues because records are used as a form. And this is something that theories of the settler state argue, that records are used to create a certain identity. And that's the reason that critics of the politics of recognition and reconciliation argue against participating and against entertaining the advances of the settler state. So it's always about what some call achieving cultural control, and that's it. And what that means is turning their back to these efforts and creating their own version of the events as a way of rejecting these narratives. So I think it's a very interesting part on how memory is used to create a certain narrative, and at the same time how Indigenous people challenge that narrative, like producing all these different meanings. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. No, it's just struck me again. We kind of, in Western tradition, kind of imbue records and archives as being sort of neutral and sort of touchstones of trust. But obviously, as you say, they're kind of curated. They're tools that are used. There's sort of one side gathers more, and people can operate in a different sort of sphere of how they choose to get their voice across. And archives aren't neutral, and us as archivists as well are having to adopt more sort of radical empathy and see how you kind of curate collections and what you take in, and that. So yeah, really interesting your points as well on the sort of cultural, but not there's the political side, and archives and records aren't neutral and are political. So yeah, very interesting themes you've drawn out. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Just before I pass over to Indrajit, who I think wants to say something, thank you so much for that input as well, Charles. I think it's very important also to bring up the work that's going on currently in academia on decolonizing the curriculum, because this all ties in with what we've been talking about, right? In that there is never there's a huge imbalance, which is a huge injustice in the voices and in the production of knowledge, not just in the production of narratives, which I guess is a similar thing. So yeah, I think we should definitely flag that up as well. Indrajit, please.
Thanks, and thanks also to the previous interventions. I think they were hugely important, not only Erik in sort of explaining what you were, talking about in terms of hope and its cultural dynamics, but generally getting us to reflect on such questions as hope and its politics. Erik, I was really fascinated with the depth in which you sort of presented the ways in which people hope for various things, for themselves to be heard, to take action, etc. And my question is more methodological, which you touched on a bit, but I just wondered if you could reflect on the challenges of studying something like hope. You started by saying how difficult and how controversial the whole idea of hope is. And last week we had a very provocative conversation between Mel and Joe about the problems with hope. And I know you have 4 minutes for this entire sort of thing, and I recognize the constraints of time. But very quickly, any thoughts on the challenges of understanding hope, especially that you came across in your work?
Yes, I think that hope, and perhaps I can tie this with the idea of decolonizing academia, the curriculum, is that I think that the provocative discussion of last week, which was incredible actually, I think that it has a very particular line of hope as something that is very aspirational and something against always positive in the future. But I think that the way it's taught in other traditions, it shows on other aspects. It can show in Latin American political thought, it may show this other political dimension to what it means to actually having a decolonial project. And if one looks at what it means for indigenous people, one may get different answers. I will not dare to say what indigenous knowledge has to say about that. So I think that a dialogue between traditions may show different conditions and the need to think of hope beyond the usual terms, which are very clearly defined. And I think that the brilliant discussion of last week shows that it only follows one line of one genealogy that one can trace in a very specific way. But if one studies other traditions, it may show different elements and the role that it plays for many authors.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Erik. That's it, Laura. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. So I think that's it. I didn't know if Mel wanted to say anything else about the next sessions that are coming up, perhaps, before we close. But other than that, thank you so much to Dr. Cardona-Gomez for his work. It's not the first time someone's called you that officially.
Yeah.
And, thank you very much to Indrajit and Mel and the rest of the York Hope Consortium for organising the event today, for everyone for attending as well. So thank you. Mel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erik and Lauren, for such a brilliant discussion. It's nice to have been in the audience and been able to enjoy that, and I look forward to future discussions. As Indrajit said, now that we've kind of roped you in on this, we're not going to let either of you go. So yeah, thank you very much. And if people are interested in our future events, please do follow our YouTube channel and Twitter. I think I'll put the links in the chat, but also they should be on the York events page, University of York's events page, and the politics department. So we're shared kind of across the university. But yeah, thank you both again. It's been brilliant, and I hope everybody else has enjoyed it as much as I have. Okay, see you all later.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.